80 unguided rockets shot out of the launchers and hurtled toward their targets. And we, without waiting for results, sharply changed course, continuing to scrape the surface at maximum speed toward the gathering point to pick up the first platoon. I didn't expect to destroy the Titans with our rockets. Their heavily armored bodies were beyond our firepower, but our nasty little gifts were more than capable of knocking out their scanner effectors, damaging their auxiliary equipment, and thus significantly reducing the Giants' combat effectiveness and firing accuracy. When we touched down at the meeting point, 12 cadets in combat suits and one scalpel bot climbed up the ramps of the bots. Major Doyle's men had not directly engaged in combat, suffering only one wounded. While we had lost almost half of our personnel, and I still didn't know the casualties of Fulton and the squads that attacked the enemy ship. Someone in the capital would pay dearly for this, even if not immediately. I don't forgive things like this that we lifted off from the asteroid and began to slowly accelerate. Compared to the engines of a spacecraft, our weak engines couldn't give us much speed, and it took us almost 2 days to reach the rendezvous point with the recon ships. The bots from Fulton's platoon were already waiting for us. Stephen had managed to avoid any losses. The attack by Justwinder's squads on Roy's ship had diverted most of the pursuers, allowing him to maneuver through the icy desert, break away from them in a quick dash, and then escape into space. The recon ships arrived just on time. I ordered everyone to board, and the ships left the system for another 2 days. Meanwhile, Inga and I stayed in our landing bot, waiting for Justwinder's squad at the meeting point. We saw Roy's patrols, but they flew far enough to prevent us from fearing detection in our stationary and well-camouflaged machine. A day passed with no results, and I decided to conduct a reconnaissance, heading toward the asteroid. Inga shrugged and said she had been thinking of suggesting the same thing, that we took the risk of launching a drone, which accelerated and flew in passive mode, without activating active scanning, a few hundred kilometers from the asteroid before returning to our bot. After analyzing the image the probe captured, the bot's computer clearly identified the mangled remains of a 3rd platoon landing bot from Fulton's unit. The fate of Justwinder's bot remained unclear. We set course for the rendezvous point, but we didn't fly directly there. Instead, we spiraled outward, avoiding encounters with Roy's increasing presence in the system while scanning the space in search of our comrades. Only when we decided to take a risk and maxed out the scanning power did we detect a faint signal far from the meeting point. The bot from the 3rd section of the 1st platoon looked terrible. It was riddled with enemy warhead detonation elements, like a porcupine with spikes, but its camouflage was working almost fully, which saved the machine from being detected by Roy. The power plant was barely outputting a quarter of its capacity, and the bot was overloaded to the limit, as both sections had packed into it almost completely. One scalpel had to be abandoned and blown up, but all the surviving cadets and the 6 dead comrades from the planetoid were evacuated. We barely made it to the rendezvous point, but we did, and Lieutenant Gale from the medium recon trio, with obvious relief, ordered us to set a course out of the system, away from Temp 112. A couple of hours after leaving the system, Captain Marcus Doyle approached me with a grim expression and said he had something serious to discuss with me. Commander, he began with a slight uncertainty in his voice, as if hesitating to ask such a question, but finally decided to. Do you have influential enemies? Unfortunately, Marcus, yes, I replied bleakly. And what made you think of that? I thought so, Captain Doyle said, slightly shaking his head. You see, Commander, when you ordered us to organize control of the area adjacent to the landing zone, I stumbled upon remnants of a reconnaissance drone network. Someone had seeded them there even before Roy's arrival. Then the enemy, naturally, found and destroyed most of the devices, but some remained. I extracted information from them, and there was no special encryption, only standard military codes. So, when you gave us the task here aboard the ship, you said that according to reconnaissance, there was no more than a standard company of Roy's forces on the asteroid. You were relying on the reconnaissance data provided by the General Staff, right? Naturally, Well, Commander, those reconnaissance data were falsified. Not an error, not an inaccuracy, but a deliberate fabrication. The asteroid's reconnaissance was conducted by scat probes. I'm familiar with that model. Such a probe accelerates, activates its electronic warfare system, and then flies tangentially to the target, scanning the area. Its scanner sensitivity is more than sufficient to intercept signals from reconnaissance drones on the surface, and it most certainly picked them up, sent back a key code, and downloaded the information package. I did the same when I found the remnants of the drone network on the surface. And I want to tell you, Commander, that from the very beginning, since Roy's landing, the asteroid had been occupied by a battalion reinforced with heavy robots. Not a standard enemy company. Someone deliberately altered the probe's data, and that someone clearly didn't want you and your people to return alive. Thank you, Marcus, I replied after nearly a minute. This is very valuable information. For me, I knew I had enemies, but I didn't think they'd go this far. I apologize for unintentionally putting you and your men at such risk. No need to apologize, Commander. Captain Doyle smirked. The fallen are regrettable. They were real soldiers, but we're alive. And you know, if you ever get an invitation to a free ticket party like this again, don't forget to grab one for me. Actually, Marcus, I replied with a somewhat grim smile. From now on, I plan to organize parties like that myself, rather than get free tickets. And you can rest assured, as soon as I manage it, I'll send you a VIP invite to a front row table, close to the stage that we were delivered back to Titan by the same assault transport that had taken us to the temp system. General Barrington was already aware of the results of our raid, and, upon our arrival, immediately welcomed us, along with Captain Marcus Doyle, into his office. The fact that you're alive, gentlemen, General Barrington said after the mutual greetings, genuinely surprises those who are in the know. And the fact that, in this situation, you actually completed the mission is something that hardly anyone believes at first. We lost 14 men, sir, I responded to the general. When we left for the operation, I promised to protect your people. Unfortunately, I failed and did not keep my word. This is war, Lieutenant. I've told you this before. Everyone who went with you volunteered. I had no right to send cadets on such an operation just by my order. Sir, Captain, Marcus Doyle quietly interjected. It's not just about the war and the inevitable losses. We were betrayed. Betrayed? What do you mean, Captain? Roy doesn't make contact with humans. How could you have been betrayed? This wasn't in the reports, sir, I answered for Doyle. I didn't want this information to fall into the wrong hands before it was time. Andre, please tell the general everything I heard from you right after the operation. Barrington listened silently, without interrupting or asking questions. With every word from Captain Doyle, the general grew darker. For you, Lieutenant, this means only one thing. Barrington spoke after Doyle finished his report. Now these people will stop at nothing. There's no retreat for them anymore. You still have some time, as they don't yet know you. Have proof of their betrayal, but once they realize they are facing exposure. But, sir, no ranks, Captain Dot, understood. But we still don't know who exactly did this. With evidence like this, the security officers will crack the case in no time. You can be sure of that, the general said with a grim smile. You have no idea what these guys are capable of once they get the go-ahead. So I recommend holding off on this information for now. It'll be easier for you. For the official announcement of the Commission's decision, the Army General, Barrington, invited me to the Ministry of Defense's central building, comfortably located in the suburbs of the capital. I left the flycar in the department parking lot, where a lieutenant from security met me and escorted me to the office of the chairman of the New Technology and Weaponry Commission. Barrington was not alone in his office. Seated behind the conference table was another high-ranking officer, a major general, who looked like anyone but a military man. The uniform fit him like a saddle on a cow, and it was immediately clear that he wore it very rarely. General Barrington. I began my report, but the general stopped me with a gesture. Good afternoon, Mr. Briggs. You're not here as a lieutenant, but as the head of the Briggs Arms Company, so feel free to make yourself comfortable. Before we get down to business, I'd like to introduce you to someone. Actually, you've already met, but the circumstances of your first meeting didn't lend themselves to pleasantries or even a simple introduction. Major General, I'm pleased to introduce you to the officer who organized and personally led the operation to evacuate you from the temp system. Lieutenant Nathan Briggs, who, in addition to his military duties, is the head of the Briggs Arms Company. It's a pleasure, young man, said the Major General in a tone that was anything but military. I'm Professor Jackson from the Military Technical University in Jakarta. On temp, I was heading a research lab studying. He trailed off as soon as he caught a stern look from General Barrington. Well, that's not important now. What matters is that my team and I are deeply grateful to you for saving our lives. I hadn't had a chance to meet the rescued scientists during the operation. They hadn't flown to the rendezvous point on my shuttle, and the moment they arrived, they were immediately transferred to one of the recon ships, which jumped out of the system without delay. Always happy to help. Professor Jackson, I replied, picking up the relaxed tone he'd set. Well then, gentlemen, let's move on to the real reason we're here, Barrington said, his voice now fully official. The field trials of the new EW Systems 4 drop shuttles, combat drones, and power armor, developed by the Briggs Arms Company, have been declared a success by the Commission. The Ministry of Defense has decided to officially adopt these systems and place an order to retrofit 1,000 drop shuttles along with the corresponding number of Scalpel-class drones and armored suits. Once this contract is fulfilled, the Ministry will consider placing additional orders to modernize other types of weapons and systems. Technically, the contract must be awarded through an open bid, he continued. But since no other companies submitted proposals, the decision has been made to award the contract directly to the Briggs Arms Company. Congratulations, Mr. Briggs. This is your first government contract. That's no small milestone. Thank you, General, I replied, still ignoring formal protocol. Fortunately, the General didn't seem to mind. And now, gentlemen, Barrington added with a wry smile, we get to the fun part, negotiating the terms. The company's proposed pricing was included in the initial documentation, and the Ministry finds it acceptable. But that still leaves the matter of the advance payment. The contract stipulates an upfront transfer to cover equipment, materials, and other necessary expenses. The only question is the size of that advance. Mr. Briggs, I'd like you to justify the amount your company is requesting. This was the key moment for me. I knew exactly how much money we needed to fulfill the order. Jeff and Professor Stein had already helped me calculate every detail. But I had a different goal in mind. I wanted to secure a much larger advance to fund our next round of innovations. General, I began carefully, choosing my words. Your commission has seen firsthand that the Briggs Arms Company can deliver truly groundbreaking military technologies. However, bringing such innovations to life, and more importantly, turning them into operational hardware, requires significant investment. We're not asking for government funding for our research. We're a private company, and I understand. That responsibility lies with us. But I do hope the Ministry will consider increasing the advance on this contract. That would allow us to present your commission, by the time the order is fulfilled, with one or even two more systems as innovative as our new EW suite. I expected as much, Barrington said with a nod. And that's precisely why I invited Professor to today's meeting. Now, gentlemen, I must step away for about an hour. I have another appointment. Mr. Briggs, during that time, your task is simple. Convince the professor that your upcoming developments are worth the Ministry's interest. The final size of the advance will depend entirely on how persuasive you are. Let's go, gentlemen. My aide will escort you to a more suitable room for your discussion. The Indonesian professor turned out to be an exceptionally passionate man. Plasma physics, his primary field of expertise, demanded extensive knowledge in numerous adjacent disciplines, and he not only possessed that knowledge but went well beyond it. Naturally, I didn't lay all my cards on the table for a uniformed scientist, but I did share the foundation of our current developments. I told him about our plans to design new scanners and communication systems, and about the principles driving those efforts. I hinted that the level we were aiming for would help correct the imbalance, present both in our forces and ROIs, between the dominance of electronic warfare systems and the underdeveloped state of communications. The hour flew by unnoticed, and Barrington's polite aide soon returned to escort us back to the general's office. Well, Professor, Barrington asked with genuine interest, what's your verdict on Mr. Briggs's proposals? The general looked energetic and upbeat. Clearly, his prior meeting hadn't soured his mood. You know, Vincent, the professor replied thoughtfully, using the general's first name and in doing so thoroughly trampling over every military formality. But Barrington didn't react, clearly used to this scientist's disregard for protocol. If it were up to me, this young man would get everything he asked for. In fact, I'd call him every evening just to check whether he needed anything else. From you. Barrington gave him a mock incredulous look. You're the one I can never squeeze a spare cent out of. That's exactly why I brought you in. I figured with you involved, not a single dollar of the defense budget would be spent without a fight. And now you're talking about bonuses? Vincent, the professor replied quietly. What Mr. Briggs is offering us isn't just another gadget or some impressive new weapon. What he's capable of building could bring us materially closer to victory. And considering the current state of the front, I'd even say, not just closer, but make that victory possible at all. It's that serious? The general asked, clearly taken aback. More than serious. Well then, Mr. Briggs, said Barrington, shifting in tone. This was not the direction I expected our conversation to take. I'll need time to think this through and coordinate the details with the ministry. You'll be informed of our decision sometime tomorrow. We ended up receiving an advance equal to 90% of the total contract value. I hadn't dared to dream of anything like that. Evidently, the professor and General Barrington had found exactly the right words to justify it that I never paid much attention to social news. There was already plenty to worry about without it, but what was happening online now managed to reach even me. A massive corruption scandal was erupting across the Earth Federation, and while I might have otherwise let it slip past my awareness, that familiar nagging worm of doubt in the back of my skull had started banging its little hammers against my brain pan again. As usual, it offered no explanation, just noise, but I'd learned not to ignore that creature's instincts, so I decided to look into the matter more closely. Upon further inspection, it turned out that the target of this media assault was the arms company. It was being thoroughly dragged through the mud by numerous online publications, especially the ones I knew for a fact were generously funded by my competitors. The accusations centered on unfair competition and bribing officials to secure favorable terms in Ministry of Defense contracts. It was the same old song that had played since the dawn of commerce. After a few days of this media frenzy, the critics escalated from words to action. Several high-ranking executives of the company were arrested. Perhaps there was some truth buried in the pile of grandiose accusations, or maybe there wasn't. But the usual legal carousel kicked into motion with impressive vigor. Investigators, attorneys, witnesses, pretrial detentions, and a parade of unnamed persons of interest, since none of this touched me directly. Yet, I kept on with my work. Studies at the academy demanded plenty of time, and on top of that, I constantly had to meet with contractors, defense ministry officials, other government representatives, equipment suppliers, and a whole cast of essential figures without whom large-scale production of our electronic warfare systems would have been impossible. Thanks to the generous funding we'd secured, my scientific engineering group acquired top-tier equipment and threw themselves into the development of new processors. These were based on cutting-edge architectures informed by the latest breakthroughs in the field. We set ourselves an ambitious goal to radically improve the quality of communications across the Federation's military that a more personal obsession kept tugging at me too, deploying remotely operated assault drones, piloted by a single operator, in a command module. I hadn't shared that idea with anyone yet, but more and more of the Briggs Arms Company's new projects were aligning with that vision, whether by design or by fate. Roughly 10 days after we wrapped our operation, I was unexpectedly summoned to the office of the Chief of the General Staff Academy. General of the Army O'Sullivan received me with solemn dignity, listened carefully to my report, and handed me a new qualification patch, augmented by another boost in combat experience. Then he informed me that, for my successful raid in the temp system, I had been nominated for early promotion. And so, I became a lieutenant, placing me on equal footing with the typical graduates of the Federation's higher military academies. Caught up in all these responsibilities, I only followed the corruption scandal in scattered glimpses. That's probably why I didn't hear the warning bells soon enough in the reports coming from network journalists. But in truth, the signs of trouble didn't start with them that a commission from the Ministry of Defense had arrived at the academy. I had no idea what those puffed-up turkeys with general stars on their shoulders were up to, and frankly, I didn't care to find out. Until a courier strode straight into our classroom during a lecture on inter-branch coordination and summit. Me to appear before the high-ranking commission and answer their questions. I stepped out. I caught a glimpse of Major Lyndon and his cronies smirking with thinly veiled satisfaction. I decided not to dwell on it. Maybe I should have. Lieutenant Briggs, the lieutenant general, intoned with a voice heavy with self-importance after hearing my brief report. He didn't bother to introduce himself. The commission has reviewed your personal file thoroughly, and we have questions, not only for you, but also for those who sponsored your admission into the General Staff Academy. We will question them in due time, but here and now, you will answer. I waited in silence. Are you not interested in knowing what the commission wishes to ask you, Lieutenant? Inquired a major general seated to the chairman's right, with what I considered a remarkably foolish question. Sir, I replied in an even tone. I am awaiting questions from the chairman or any member of the commission and am prepared to answer them to the best of my ability. Any other action or comment on my part would violate the chain of command. Very well, Lieutenant. Since you want to be formal, here's your first question, the chairman resumed, glancing at his tablet. How is it that, while serving as a mid-level research associate at a corporation, you acquired rights to patents that should have remained the property of the company you worked for? They grilled me for over 2 hours. All the questions were variations of things I'd been asked before, and by now, I answered them mechanically, almost droning, all the while trying to discern what they really wanted. The only thing remotely new came at the very end. A report from Colonel General Sversky recently reached the Ministry of Defense's Analytical Department, the chairman said. It describes a new combat scenario you implemented during a training simulation on Temp 4. This scenario reportedly achieved combat effectiveness more than 3 times higher than the outcome of the actual battle led by Lieutenant General Sanders, and over twice the maximum theoretical effectiveness predicted by General Staff analysts. The Commission has reviewed the simulation carefully. We want to know what guided your decision to pull orbital fortresses and 7th Fleet vessels away from planetary defense and concentrate them around a single small surface zone where you and your forces were located? Answer, Lieutenant. I was guided primarily by the goal of maximizing combat effectiveness, sir, I replied. Additionally, I took into account the opportunity to provide at least some form of reliable refuge for a portion, however small, of the planet's population. Were you aware, when making that decision, that the majority of the planet's population would be left unprotected and fall into enemy hands? I was. It was a conscious decision. Very good, Lieutenant. Very good. The general nodded slowly, though his eyes remained cold. Now, one final question. You are the head of the Briggs Arms Company, which is currently fulfilling a government contract. At the same time, you are enrolled in the General Staff Academy, preparing to become a senior officer in our Army. How do you explain this? I don't see any conflict between those two pursuits, Colonel General. I answered evenly. I am genuinely committed to a military career, and I am equally committed to producing high-quality weapons and military systems, something our Army desperately needs. Don't you think, Lieutenant, he pressed, that your potential future rank could give your company an unfair advantage in Ministry of Defense contracts? Something pricked at the back of my mind. My inner combat instincts were waking up again. That phrasing, I'd heard something like it before. Yes, almost word for word. Those were the accusations once leveled against executives of the old arms consortium. I don't operate on assumptions, Colonel General, I replied calmly. Speculation without evidence remains just that, speculation. All I can say with full confidence is that such a possibility has never been considered by me. A mistake, Lieutenant. A serious mistake. It's better to think about these things yourself before someone else starts thinking about them for you. You're dismissed. For now. But take time to reflect on what I've said. Jeff's call came while I was having lunch at the academy. Commander, what the hell is going on? My chief engineer's voice was tight with worry. Not sure yet, Jeff. What's happened? For the past hour, the network media's been ripping our company to shreds. We're being accused of collusion with the Arms Consortium. Some hacks are claiming they conducted a journalistic investigation and are now going on air with this smug look, saying we've been purchasing large volumes of equipment from them, which supposedly means we're financially entangled and therefore possibly involved in corruption schemes. It's complete nonsense, but they're spreading it far and wide like it's gospel. Bastards. Okay, stop. Jeff, Sounds like someone's launched a war. Probably one of our competitors. We're not their main target, but they must think. Knocking us down kills two birds with one stone. Call the professor and start looking for a reliable legal firm. We'll need a solid attorney. Should have handled this earlier, but here we are. We did have in-house legal staff, of course, but they focused on commercial law, and this clearly called for something very different. Commander, if you want fast and competent, don't waste time searching. My sister's husband is a decent lawyer. Criminal law is his bread and butter. And I have a feeling that's exactly what we're dealing with. With the media heat like this, it's only a matter of time before law enforcement or security services come knocking. All right, Jeff, get in touch with him. We'll figure out how to climb out of this mess. In the comfortable cabin of the presidential flycar, President Tomlinson resumed the discussion with his aide, one that had been interrupted by the launch ceremony of the new battleship. What's next on our list? Mr. President, you asked to be kept informed if Lieutenant Briggs and his arms company managed to produce anything of substance. And did they? As far as I can tell, they did. They've developed a rather effective electronic warfare system and even field-tested it during the temp system evacuation. They successfully extracted personnel from the plasma weapons research lab. Is that so? And any progress on plasma tech itself? Still at the fundamental research stage. Functional prototypes are a long way off. All right, let's get back to Briggs. The Ministry of Defense has officially adopted his EW system and signed a major contract with his company. And no one's tried to tear him down yet. Oh, they've tried. He's refused every offer to sell the company. There's even suspicion that his team was supposed to face a serious incident during testing. Either it failed to happen, or they managed to sidestep it entirely. The latter seems more likely. Right now, there's a coordinated media campaign targeting his company, trying to link it to the Old Arms Consortium scandal. The accusations are obviously fabricated, but the execution is professional. Public opinion is already shifting. Keep watching him. And if anything major happens, I want to know immediately. They arrested me right in my room at the academy. 3 plainclothes agents came in, showed a warrant, and asked me to come with them. They were polite enough and even let me contact my lawyer, but that's where the circus really began. Neither I nor my attorney could make sense of the charges at first, but once they were finally read out loud, the absurdity of the whole situation only deepened. Defendant Briggs, you are charged with multiple attempts to bribe federal officials for personal gain in order to secure favorable conditions for a company owned by your mother under contract with the Ministry of Defense. Furthermore, you are accused of misusing funds advanced to the Briggs Arms Company under said contract. Taken together, these crimes carry a potential sentence of up to 15 years in prison. Do you plead guilty to these charges? The investigator paused, waiting for our response. My client does not plead guilty to any of the charges, said my attorney, in a calm, measured tone. He would like to see the evidence, if you please. Of course, solid evidence was out of the question. They simply didn't have any. But the Earth Federation's security service wasn't run by fools. The investigators here were seasoned professionals. If there was one thing they excelled at, it was building cases out of thin air, especially when someone gave them the right incentive. When there's no hard evidence in a corruption case, there are still a few options available. First, the absence of direct proof can be compensated by an overwhelming volume of circumstantial evidence. I was shown endless surveillance footage, both internal and external, where I was indeed seen meeting with various individuals, some of whom were federal officials. A number of those recordings had no sound. Others had audio snippets taken out of context. Phrases like, "I think this approach will be mutually beneficial," or "it seems both sides have an interest in this outcome." Each of these clips came with carefully constructed narratives, mostly empty verbiage, that, when strung together, gave the impression of an exhaustive investigation and, supposedly, a pattern of misconduct. But taken one by one, each element amounted to little more than conjecture dressed up in legalese. Second, you can always discredit and demonize the accused, especially in the eyes of judges and the public. That becomes crucial if the trial is open. The investigators had clearly put effort into that angle too. My dual status as an academy cadet and part owner of an arms company was a favorite target. Naturally, my enrollment was interpreted as a calculated move to lobby for my family's interests within the military-industrial complex. They even dredged up that infamous training exercise, where I was accused of cowardice and allegedly abandoned an entire planet's civilian population to enemy forces. Never mind that it was just a simulation. They also cast doubt on my academic record, citing indirect evidence of bribery during exams, though they admitted the investigation had been closed due to the statute of limitations. I knew exactly who I had to thank for that little addition to the indictment, but that knowledge didn't make things any easier to stomach. And finally, witnesses. A whole category unto themselves. If they really want to, investigators can always find a weak link, especially among mid-level officials. A bureaucrat caught taking a bribe or embezzling funds will do just about anything to avoid prison time, including becoming a talking head in any criminal case the investigators point them toward. This time was no different. They found 3 minor functionaries from the Ministry of Defense, people I had met once or twice at most, who, it turned out, were already under the security service's thumb. These men looked me straight in the eye during confrontations and, with a sincerity worthy of theater, assured the investigator that I had offered them bribes, which, of course, they had heroically refused. As a final flourish, they charged me with misappropriating a portion of the advance paid out by the Ministry of Defense. The Briggs Arms Company had indeed used part of the funds to purchase equipment that wasn't directly tied to the current contract, but the expenditures had no effect on deadlines or product quality. The investigator barely listened to my explanations. It was obvious this was just another brick in the wall, a convenient addition meant to bury me in court. After reviewing the case files, my lawyer let out a heavy sigh. Tough one. It's clear to me the whole thing's a setup, but this avalanche of negative press could seriously influence the judges or the jury. And now there's a storm online. The arms consortium is being torn to pieces. Turns out there are a few shady facts in their background, and someone's skillfully blown them up into a narrative that borders on treason. And of course, your family's company keeps getting dragged into it. Always by association, but you know how public perception works. It's all malleable. I'll do everything I can to dismantle the charges, maybe even all of them, assuming the court isn't completely biased. But we'll need a backup plan, because I can't promise we'll win this on law alone. And what is this trump card? Your gold star and iron cross, my lawyer said calmly. We're at war, after all, and you've received the highest combat honors, which changes things. Both awards carry certain privileges. Not many people know the finer points, but during wartime, recipients of either decoration can, under specific circumstances, have criminal charges dismissed through formal endorsements by senior officers in the Federation military. It doesn't apply to every article of the criminal code, but your case qualifies. This clause was added to the statutes at the beginning of the war, back when things were dire, and every capable soldier or officer could tip the balance. If 10 high-ranking officers are willing to vouch for you, formally declaring their belief that the charges are unfounded and that losing an officer like you could delay our victory, then the prosecution can be suspended until the end of the war and the charges dropped altogether. 10 senior officers? I echoed. And what's at stake for them? If it later turns out the accusations were substantiated, it could seriously damage their careers. But the evidence would have to be rock solid for that to happen. To be honest with you, Serge, I said, eyeing him skeptically, I don't know if there are that many generals and admirals who'd risk their careers for me. And you just told me yourself about the flood of bad press. If we have to, I'll contact every potential sponsor, anyone you've served with or who's crossed paths with you. The proceedings will be public. They'll be able to see for themselves and make their own decision. All right, Serge, I nodded slowly. Let's do it your way. But since things have taken such a brutal turn, I think it's time we lay all our cards on the table. I paused a moment, then added, get in touch with Major Marcus Doyle of the 105th Infantry Division. He'll give you evidence of the betrayal that took place during our last operation in the Temp 112 system. I believe the Ministry of Defense's internal security will find those materials very compelling. The trial was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Our competitors' lobbyists were pushing with everything they had, and the investigators were working in overdrive. The prosecution moved swiftly, approving the indictment at record speed. The tension surrounding the Briggs Arms Company had reached its boiling point, and the architects of the scandal were determined to bring their case to trial at the peak of public outrage. But the Briggs Arms Company wasn't planning to go down without a fight. It had its own allies in government, its own media mouthpieces, and a few loyal public figures on retainer. Our rivals began to feel the sting of carefully aimed counterattacks, striking their weak points, which, like ours, were many. Some of the cases brought against the company's leadership began to collapse like houses of cards. The Briggs Company didn't have the same resources as our opponents, but breaking things is always easier than building them. And dismantling a criminal case is often far simpler than seeing one through to a verdict. The public swayed wildly from one extreme to the other, unable to understand what was truly happening or why the world had suddenly gone mad. Over the years, the weapons corporations had built up enormous vats of informational sludge, which until now had simmered quietly in the background, bubbling up in the form of petty scandals and minor investigations. But now, those vats were erupting into the infosphere like violent geysers, spewing their filth in all directions. Amid this storm, my case seemed like a relatively minor episode, but it still managed to draw the attention of many, including people who knew me personally. When the tide of slander flooding my name online reached its peak, something unexpected happened. In the comments under the numerous paid articles and forum threads, clearly funded by the same handlers, a different kind of message began to appear, one that did not align with the expectations of their sponsors. This is all bullshit. And so is your paper. I fought alongside Briggs on Proxima. If not for him, I'd be rotting in a Roy prison camp or dead from my wounds. If this man's building weapons now, then I trust our armies in good hands. Back the hell off, assholes. Corporal Anthony Graves, Planetary Assault Special Forces. You're calling him a coward? The cadet who took command of a whole regiment when every officer was killed? The guy who rescued over 150 of our prisoners from the Roys on Protus 3? I owe him my life, and I'm not the only one. He bribed someone. I'd sooner believe he punched someone in the face for trying to extort a bribe. What you're publishing is paid slander. Captain Evan Irwin, 105th Infantry Division. Briggs bought his degrees. I personally examined him in biochemistry, and none of you so-called journalists even bothered to contact me. If you're going to lie, at least learn how to do it well. You clearly haven't. At this point, over 1 million of our citizens owe this young man their lives. Did he buy that? 2. Professor Lutzko, Lunar Colonial Institute of Technology. You've completely lost your moral compass, gentlemen, or more likely, sold it off. I saw Briggs in action when he was still a cadet. My own son, also a cadet, came back alive from Protus 3 solely thanks to him. The combat effectiveness of the heavy assault brigade he commanded was calculated at 132%. And you want to strip our army of an officer like that? Open your criminal code, gentlemen. There's a section there about treason. Take a good look. You might find it relevant. Admiral James Fulton, 5th Strike Fleet. Unfortunately, I've never met Mr. Briggs personally, but I saw him lead 2 platoons into battle against a full Roy infantry battalion reinforced with 2 heavy mechs. His troops were fighting in gear developed by his own company. The outcome of that battle directly determined whether I would live or die. And since I'm alive and writing this, I can state with certainty, if getting those machines into our army requires bribes, then something in the Earth Federation is deeply, fatally rotten, and our days are numbered. Major Winning Woollandari, Associate Professor, Military Technical University. Hundreds of similar messages poured in with astonishing speed. My lawyer read them aloud to me, noting that this unexpected groundswell of support could significantly affect the case. But as it turned out, he may have underestimated our opponent, i.e. the Earth Federation. Corruption cases were handled exclusively in open court and only with a jury trial. Open didn't just mean spectators could attend in person. It meant anyone could observe virtually through the network. To my surprise, the courtroom, which was not small by any standard, was packed to the brim. In a society used to consuming all information through screens, people had still chosen to spend their time and be physically present. The court staff, unaccustomed to such crowds, were clearly on edge. I was escorted into a separate room, isolated from the courtroom by transparent walls, and left there alone. My only means of communicating with the judge and jury was through the built-in acoustic system in the table in front of me. Even before the trial began, we were introduced to the members of the court and jury. My lawyer glanced over the list and shook his head grimly. Nathan, I haven't seen a setup like this in years. The presiding judge is supposedly independent, but he's got a murky reputation. One of the associate judges is definitely in our rival's pocket. The other likely is too, though I can't say with absolute certainty. 6 of the 8 jurors are clearly planted by the opposition. One of the remaining 2 is affiliated with the very arms company we were challenging. I have no idea why they allowed him on the jury. The last one, I've got nothing. But it won't change the outcome. The verdict is going to be guilty, that's a given. Still, we'll fight it. The more ridiculous the sentence, the stronger the grounds for appeal. And what about the character witness option? I asked. That's our last resort. I'd rather not play that card unless we have to. You're not confident it'll work, and neither am I. But if it comes to that, we'll try. Otherwise, they'll chew you up and spit you out. The trial itself turned out to be a condensed rerun of the investigation. The same witnesses were summoned, repeating the same testimonies. The same pieces of evidence were read aloud, surveillance of my meetings with officials, interpreted through narratives concocted by the prosecution. But every time the momentum of this orchestrated smear campaign built up, my lawyer stepped in. He disrupted the rhythm of their attack, dismantling the prosecution's case argument by argument, blow by blow, at one point. I truly began to think the case was falling apart. The prosecution's speeches were now accompanied by a steady murmur of disapproval from the crowd. But the judges, veterans of the bureaucratic trenches, didn't so much as flinch. Their exchanges with my attorney resembled a dialogue between the deaf and the blind. The audience began to lose patience. The noise grew louder. The presiding judge called for silence and decorum, threatening to clear the room if necessary, and the unrest settled. Somewhat, the trial was nearing its conclusion. Finally, the court granted the defense its turn for a closing statement. An MY lawyer based his address on some of the most powerful messages of support he had previously read to me from the network, weaving them together with sharp commentary and solid citations. The effect on the audience was electric. The applause was long and heartfelt. Yet the judges and jurors remained composed and impassive. The judge announced a recess for the jury to deliberate. They withdrew to the conference room. We didn't wait long. Just 30 minutes later, the court reconvened to announce the verdict. By a vote of 7-1, the judge declared, the jury finds citizen Nathan Briggs guilty on all counts of the indictment. A wave of unrest rippled through the courtroom. Angry murmurs, a few shouted protests. But the judge, once again, called the room to order and was already preparing to declare the court's retirement to determine sentencing when my attorney raised his hand. Your Honor, Serge said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. The defense formally invokes the special procedural statute pertaining to the orders of the Golden Star and the Iron Cross, of which my client is a decorated recipient. The judge faltered, if only for a second. Maybe he had hoped it wouldn't come to this. Maybe he simply didn't want the proceedings to drag out any longer. But his face twitched, barely perceptible. Before he regained his composure, there was no legal basis to deny the motion. To do so would have been a flagrant violation of procedure, enough on its own to overturn the entire trial on appeal. The court accepts the defense's motion, the presiding judge said coldly. According to the statutes of the orders in question, the accused may be granted character surety by senior officers of the Earth Federation Army. If 10 or more such officers submit sworn endorsements, criminal prosecution of the accused shall be suspended for the duration of ongoing hostilities, and all charges will be dismissed. The statute does not specify a fixed time frame for these endorsements to be submitted. It merely states they must be provided within a reasonable period. Therefore, the court shall determine that time frame. Given the open nature of these proceedings and the real-time broadcast through the network, including the possibility of remote submissions, the court sets a deadline of 30 minutes from this declaration for the required sureties to be received. The clock starts now. It was painful to look at Serge. My attorney had clearly not anticipated such a low blow, and there was nothing he could object to. Legally, the judge was right. The statute didn't set a specific deadline for submitting endorsements, and there was no established precedent. The clause was so rarely invoked that case law around it was practically non-existent. The courtroom buzzed with outrage, the murmurs swelling into a restless uproar. This time, the presiding judge's commands for silence fell on deaf ears. Then a chime, soft and melodic, cut through the noise like a bell through fog. The room went silent instantly. The sound had come from the clerk's station. An endorsement has been submitted for Citizen Nathan Briggs, the clerk announced. Admiral Fulton of the Fifth Strike Fleet testifies that the charges against Citizen Briggs are false, and that losing this officer would critically affect both the timeline and the very prospect of victory in the war. The crowd roared, this time with excitement and approval. Another chime. An endorsement has been submitted. Lieutenant General Schiller, head of the Planetary Assault Military Academy, testifies. The signal rang out again. Commander of the 7th Assault Corps, Colonel General Garrett Wolfe, testifies. Commander of the 5th Strike Fleet, Admiral Jonathan Nelson, testifies. Chair of the Board of Trustees for the Planetary Assault Academy, General of the Army Vasnetsov, testifies. The chamber was in uproar. Applause, cheering, shouting. The judge was all but forgotten. The court officers made no attempt to restore order, keeping only a watchful eye to ensure no one crossed the boundary into restricted areas. Professor at the General Staff Academy, Colonel General Sversky, testifies. Nearly 20 minutes had passed. The judge glanced at the clock with studied composure, though with each tick of the minute hand, his expression grew steadier, more confident. He was beginning to believe the endorsements had run their course. Chair of the Commission for Advanced Weapons and Technology, General of the Army Barrington, testifies. Professor at the Military Technical University, Lieutenant General Alatas, testifies. The judge began to shift in his seat. 5 minutes remained, and 8 endorsements had been submitted. Close, but not enough. I knew, though, that the list of officers who might vouch for me had all but run dry. The judge's nervousness was misplaced. There was no one left. 2 minutes passed in taut silence. Every eye was on the clerk's station. Then, breaking the tension like a thunderclap, the expected chime rang out, louder now in the hush that preceded it. General of the Army O'Sullivan, Commandant of the General Staff Academy, testifies. That one stunned me. I'd never imagined he'd weigh in on my behalf. All the more reason to feel grateful. But time was slipping away. Barely 2 minutes remained, and we still needed one more to one moved. No one breathed. The courtroom held still like a held breath. The final chime rang just as the 29th minute struck. The judge visibly jolted in his chair. The clerk opened the message, but instead of reading it, he froze, staring at the screen as if it were a puzzle he couldn't solve. He read it again, then again. His expression turned to disbelief. Clerk, the judge growled, his patience snapping, read the message aloud. The clerk snapped out of his stupor and, in a flat, mechanical voice, said, an endorsement has been submitted for Citizen Nathan Briggs, Supreme Commander of the Earth Federation Armed Forces. Marshal David Tomlinson testifies. I was released from custody right there in the courtroom, and from that moment on, everything flipped upside down. I hadn't even made it back to my room at the academy when my communicator buzzed with a call from a masked number. Mr. Briggs, came a polite male voice. This is Senior Lieutenant Jackson, Internal Security Division, Ministry of Defense. Do you have a moment? I'm listening. Congratulations on having all charges dropped, Mr. Briggs. They seemed absurd from the start, and I sincerely hope neither you nor your company will have to face this kind of legal abuse again. Thank you, Lieutenant. I'm glad it's over too, but I imagine that's not the only reason you're calling. Of course not, Jackson replied. I'd like to invite you in to discuss the actions of an unidentified group that manipulated intelligence regarding enemy forces near the research facility in the Temp 112 system. I understand you've just been released, so I won't insist on an immediate meeting, but, Lieutenant, I interrupted gently. In matters like this, delay can be costly. Where should I come? Within a day or two, the media storm hammering the Briggs Arms Company died down dramatically. The personal attacks on the company, once a daily avalanche, vanished entirely. Even more bizarre, several major outlets that had been slinging mud for weeks suddenly published retractions and even formal apologies, cloaked in vague excuses about unreliable sources and lapses in editorial oversight. The reason? My attorney, emboldened by the outcome of a case he'd secretly never expected to win, he launched a legal blitzkrieg. Libel lawsuits fired off like hot rounds against the worst offenders in the media. And it worked. The publications started to hurt. Flames roared up under the metaphorical chairs of their executives, and none of them had the stomach to see those cases through in open court. The executives from the Briggs Arms Company, once paraded as bribe-taking embezzlers, suddenly didn't seem quite so corrupt. Within days, they were quietly released from custody under travel restrictions, with the threat of a real sentence fading fast, likely to end with a fine or, at worst, a suspended term. Meanwhile, the lobbyists working for our competitors, previously so self-assured, were now finding themselves behind bars, facing interrogations by the Ministry of Defense's Internal Security Division. That I gave a silent round of applause to President Tomlinson. That said, I can't say I took much pleasure in the role I'd been given. Being a pawn in someone else's game leaves a bitter aftertaste, and make no mistake, the president had used me precisely in that way. Yes, I understood it. Tomlinson had needed a provocation. Something, or someone, that would force my rivals out into the open, make them deploy resources and expose themselves beyond the protective veil of bureaucracy. And he did just that. He dropped a bold and stubborn junior lieutenant into the stagnant swamp of well-fed, complacent frogs. That sudden ripple sent the fat ones into a panic, making them act rashly. My competitors must have decided this was a prime opportunity, not just to get rid of an annoyingly active newcomer, but to bite off a significant chunk of the arms market, long held by the consortium. But that bite got lodged in their throat. And then came a blow from a direction no one expected. All those accusations they'd flung at the Briggs Arms Company suddenly came crashing down on their own lobbyists and officials, courtesy of the ministry's own security division. President Tomlinson, for his part, stayed quiet through it. Only when the absurdity of the situation began to dawn even on the general public did he make his move, dramatically stepping in to vouch for me in open court. He didn't technically pressure the court. Formally, his hands were clean. But at the same time, the message couldn't have been clearer. He would not tolerate legal lawlessness, and he would restore order to the Federation. It was a masterstroke. And so the pawn, Mr. Nathan Briggs, yours truly, made it all the way across the board. No, not into a queen. That'd be a stretch for someone like me. But maybe a bishop or a knight. And for a pawn, that's not bad at all. I'm just grateful I wasn't traded off for another low-value piece. Truth be told, I'd done most of the scrambling myself. The president had simply stirred the swamp by endorsing a license for my company, then left me to fight my way forward. Had I been swallowed up along the way, he probably would have shrugged and moved on. But when the pawn had nearly completed its mission, he remembered. And he didn't let the opponent casually sweep me off the board. For that, I'm grateful. And who knows, there's still time to become a queen. Because in this shady backroom version of chess, pieces on the board can sometimes become players. We were fulfilling the order well within schedule. Ever since we had jointly repelled the attack from my so-called detractors, our relationship with the arms consortium had only improved. They were now more diligent than ever in supplying us with the necessary components. No delays, no excuses. When I unexpectedly received an invitation to meet with General Barrington, it caught me off guard. As far as I knew, the Ministry of Defense had no complaints about our contract. Out of the 1,000 assault platoon kits we had committed to, we had already delivered more than half. A good portion of that hardware had already been deployed to re-equip assault units, and I hadn't heard of any complaints from the field. Still, if the general had something to say, I was more than happy to hear it, especially since I had wanted to thank him personally for vouching for me in court. General of the Army Barrington greeted me with a reserved smile. Congratulations on your release, Mr. Briggs, he said, extending his hand. Thank you, General, I replied, matching his smile. If it weren't for your guarantee, I doubt I'd be here enjoying this conversation with you. You should thank your latest designs, Mr. Briggs. I was well aware that without your involvement, our forces would lose access to them, and that would have been a serious mistake. Besides, locking up a capable officer in wartime. Well, you understand. But let's get to the point. I invited you here specifically to discuss that new equipment of yours. Is something wrong with it? On the contrary, Mr. Briggs. He Paused, then continued in a more serious tone. A week ago, the Royce launched an assault on a planet in the Bridge 14 system. It looked more like a reconnaissance in force, limited assets, peripheral target. The planet was lightly populated and only partially terraformed. There was no real orbital defense, so when the Roy task force suddenly appeared on the edge of the system, they broke through easily and landed troops on the surface. We had no station garrison on Bridge 9. The only forces available to the local authorities were police units, not exactly equipped to resist an alien assault. We had to rush reinforcements in from the system's inner sectors. Thankfully, the Sixth Fleet reacted quickly. After temp, their combat readiness remained high. They drove the Royce off low orbit and forced them to jump out of the system. The enemy didn't have time to evacuate their landing force. That's when Colonel General Ivashkevich deployed the 65th Assault Division to retake the planet. One of its regiments had just been issued your bots, drones, and combat suits the week before. What happened next surprised everyone. The Royce were wiped out far faster than our simulations projected, with 55% fewer casualties than expected. After the operation, Ivashkevich filed a report to Admiral Kawakami, requesting accelerated re-equipment of his entire assault corps with your systems, stating that this gear fundamentally shifts the balance of power in favor of Federation ground forces. Kawakami reviewed the battle footage and forwarded the request to us with the resolution: ensure full support by all available means. Similar reports have come in from other units already using your equipment. The general looked me in the eye. So I have a question for you, Mr. Briggs. Can your company's production capacity be increased to ramp up delivery of your electronic warfare platforms and speed up modernization of the ministry's supplied tech? I hesitated for a moment. Expanding production capacity was certainly doable. We could hire additional personnel too, without much difficulty. But turning the Briggs Arms Company into an industrial giant, churning out combat hardware by the tens of thousands, that was never part of my vision. What drove me was innovation, creating and deploying breakthrough technologies, developing next-generation weapon systems, mass-producing tried-and-tested gear on an industrial scale. Let others handle that. Let those who have the infrastructure and experience with large-scale manufacturing do the stamping. General, I said after a short pause, we could scale up. But large-batch military production isn't part of our long-term strategy. We are, however, fully prepared to license the technology and all associated know-how to any of the major firms capable of serial production. Not for free, of course. The Briggs Arms Company still needs funding for foundational research and the development of next-gen prototypes. That's a very sensible offer in terms of what's best for the Federation, the general said, nodding thoughtfully. But it's also surprising, coming from the head of a private defense firm. Are you aware of how much potential profit you're giving up? Absolutely, I replied calmly. But I expect to make up for it, and then some, with the returns from our upcoming developments. We already have working prototypes that give us every reason to be optimistic. Besides, our company will remain the prime contractor on this new, larger contract. We'll simply bring the others in as subcontractors. Submit your bid, Mr. Briggs. The Ministry of Defense is prepared to place an order with the Briggs Arms Company for 15,000 units, EW platforms, scalpel bots, and assault armor sets. This would effectively re-equip all assault divisions in the Army. Thank you for your trust, General. Don't let me down, Mr. Briggs. I earned my reputation by keeping our troops supplied through the darkest years of this war. Now, with those dark years threatening to return, I intend to do it again and give our Army the best equipment the Federation can produce. I'm counting on you. I held the thin wafer of the new processor between my fingers, thinking about the hell we'd gone through to get it this far. The knowledge brought in by our younger specialists had helped immensely. We'd had to get creative, replacing parts with borderline miracle work made possible by bleeding-edge tech. The final result? A processor 10 times the size of the original. But that didn't bother me much. After all, a combat bot is a big machine. Plenty of room in there. The real question was where to start. The processor I held offered a vast array of possibilities. Its core function was to manage external effectors, battlefield scanners, comms units, and the full suite of electronic warfare systems. The architecture had been custom designed to fully support the specialized algorithms we'd built into the software, and now, here it was, its metallic edges cool against my skin. The key component. Our critical breakthrough. We had done it. I was a drop trooper. I was bonded to that branch of the military with every fiber of my being, and I could hardly imagine myself in any other role. But even so, I understood one harsh truth. No matter how elite, no matter how advanced, ground forces alone couldn't win a modern space war. What the Earth Federation desperately needed was a powerful fleet. And it didn't have one. No matter how many improvements I made to ground combat systems, I wouldn't be able to turn the tide of the war by myself. That much had become painfully clear. Well then, maybe we, the drop troops, had something to offer the fleet as well. It might seem exotic, even absurd, to some, but it was worth a try. I gathered the entire science and engineering team for a briefing, with Professor Stein and our chief engineer Jeff at the head of the table. Gentlemen, I said, addressing the room, you've done something incredible. You've created a system that will, in time, put our company at the very top of the industry. And that time is coming sooner than you think. But more importantly, this little wafer, I held up the processor plate in my hand, will help bring our victory closer. To mark the occasion, I'm awarding each member of the department a bonus equivalent to 1 year's salary. You've earned it. The wave of approving murmurs that followed was exactly what I'd expected. This team knew me well, and they knew I wasn't finished. Now, colleagues, I continued, I'm giving your department a challenge that's anything but routine. We're going to build remote-controlled assault drones. The concept is this. One piloted combat robot will command and control 10 subordinate unmanned units. This kind of system used to be impossible. Unstable communications would have caused constant failures and chaos in battle. But now, thanks to this, I held the processor up again. We've got uninterrupted pilot-to-drone links. The challenge is, those drones will need a high level of autonomy. The pilot of the main unit, let's call it the command mech, won't be able to micromanage every turret or every footstep of the drones. Like in a standard combat, RIG.SO. Each drone needs its own powerful onboard computer and, more importantly, a reliable software algorithm that governs its behavior in combat. That part, I'll handle myself. The rest? That's on you. By tomorrow evening, I want to see the core concept drafted. For test units, I'm planning to use 10 captured Titans we secured on Protus 3. I'm fairly confident the Ministry of Defense won't object to transferring those over to the Briggs Arms Company for experimental purposes. Lieutenant Briggs. General Garrett Wolf looked slightly surprised. This was the first time I'd used the direct contact line he'd given me after the battle for Protus 3. Good to see you, son. What's going on? Nothing quite as dire as a potential 15-year prison sentence, sir, I replied with a grin. Though, speaking of which, thank you for vouching for me. Bastards, the general muttered flatly. Couldn't agree more, sir. No ranks, Lieutenant. Yes, sir. I gave a nod. Here's the thing. I need your advice. Not as a lieutenant, but as the head of the Briggs Arms Company. I'd like to show you our latest development. I'm not asking for any help pushing it through the Ministry of Defense. What I need is your opinion on whether the new approach we've taken has real potential. A general never says no to new weapons, Wolf replied with a grin. Where and when? In an ideal world, I'd run the demo at the Planetary Assault Academy's proving grounds on Titan. But I understand it's a stretch to have troops travel that far just for a demonstration. No need to pull anyone off duty, the general said, waving it off. 5th Shock Division and I are heading into the solar system anyway, for resupply and partial rearmament. I've already seen some of your gear, by the way. Not in action yet, but still, impressive. When can we expect full deployment to the drop units? The Ministry has already signed a new contract with us. I'd say it'll take at least 6 months to fulfill. 6 months is too long, Lieutenant. I have a feeling things are going to start moving much sooner than that. He leaned forward slightly. All right. When do you want to see me? We'll be ready in a couple of weeks, I said. But I have one more request. Would you be willing to invite Admiral Nelson to the demonstration? Wolf blinked. Nelson? Why him? He's never shown the slightest interest in ground combat. I've got something for the fleet too, but I can't push it forward without the Admiral's support. It's not about lobbying. What I need is a place to field test our tech in realistic combat conditions. For that, I'll need ships. and my company doesn't exactly have a combat fleet of its own. Yet. Yet. Wolf arched an eyebrow. Well, who knows what the future holds? I smirked. I wouldn't say no. Lieutenant General Schiller, as the head of the Academy and, by extension, master of its Titan proving ground, welcomed the guests in his office. Wolf and Nelson both looked curious, and Schiller, who'd already had a sneak peek at our prototypes, was doing his best to stoke that curiosity. With casual hints and offhand remarks, he nudged them just enough to keep them hooked that in the end, the three of them decided not to waste any time. Together, they set off for the remote bunker beyond the city limits. My team and I were already on site. First, I'd planned to pilot the command mech myself and show the generals and admiral exactly how the new combat concept worked. But Inga had spent the entire night persuading me, with every tool at her disposal, that she could handle the role just as well. Meanwhile, I'd be far more useful in the bunker, standing next to our high-ranking guests. I can't say which argument finally convinced me, but by early morning, I had agreed. Gentlemen, I began, standing before the large tactical display. What you see in front of you might look like the familiar Roy-class heavy Titans, but only on the outside. Internally, 9 of them no longer have pilot cabins. They are fully automated. The space once reserved for human operators is now used for enhanced computational cores and additional ammunition reserves. Only the command unit remains manned. Wolf said, visibly skeptical. And how exactly are they going to be controlled in a real fight? One of our cadets is about to demonstrate, I replied. We've set up a simulated engagement, 10 of our Titans versus a cadet assault company. The odds, obviously, are stacked heavily in the Titans' favor. But this isn't about firepower. You know that side of them perfectly well. What I want to show you is how the unmanned units behave in battle, especially under heavy electronic warfare interference. Well then, let's have a look, Admiral Nelson said. His face showed polite curiosity, but not much more. Don't worry, Admiral. We'll get to your flying machines soon enough. Just bear with me. General Schiller gave the order, and the Titans came alive on the training field. Inga hadn't let me down. Not after she'd spent weeks putting the machines through brutal drills with Schiller's blessing. Now, under pressure, she handled them flawlessly. The Titans moved in tight formation, hammering the unfortunate Scalpels with rockets and autocannon fire. They intercepted incoming missiles mid-air, coordinated suppressive fire, repositioned fluidly, and generally looked like an unstoppable wall of destruction. What EW systems are being used? Wolf asked, narrowing his eyes. I'm not seeing any impact on their comms. Your Titans are maneuvering like no one's even trying to jam them. We started with the standard electronic warfare suite of the cadet company, I explained. At the 2-minute mark, they were reinforced by stationary battalion-grade jammers. Another minute in, we activated new generation systems developed by the ARMS Consortium. And now we're also using our latest EW platforms, the same ones, recently deployed to your Corps' newest units. Don't give me that, Lieutenant Briggs, Admiral Nelson snapped. That's not how this works. But it is, Admiral. I'm fine. Let's do this, then. Nelson pulled out his communicator. Cruiser Washington, bring us to low orbit above the Academy training ground. I want a full EW suppression blanket over the entire area. Just then, the simulation wrapped up. As expected, it ended in total victory for the upgraded Titans. Not that the opposition had much of a chance to begin with. Wolf glanced at the Admiral and smirked. Well, Lieutenant General, he said, turning to Schiller. Would you object if we made this a bit more interesting? I'd like to see how your unmanned units fare against our bull-class mechs, piloted by veterans. By all means, gentlemen, Schiller replied calmly. That's what you're here for. Transport Europa. 2. Deploy a heavy mech division onto the Academy training grounds. Wolf ordered into his comm, sim gear only, of course. Full combat escort, and give them divisional-level EW support, heavy package. Just then, Schiller's communicator pinged. He took the call. Lieutenant General, this is the Civil Administration Office of Titan. We're observing unusual military ship activity in close proximity to the colony capital. We weren't given any advance notice. Is everything under control? No need to worry, Schiller answered calmly. This is just a joint exercise between the Planetary Assault Academy and the 5th Shock Fleet. All fully under control. There's no threat to the city's infrastructure or civilian population. Well, these kinds of drills are new to us, Lieutenant General, but understood. Thank you. The call ended. The civvies are curious what we're stirring up in low orbit, Schiller chuckled. I told them not to lose sleep over it. Meanwhile, the cruiser assumed a low orbit and activated its electronic warfare systems. Cadet, I said to Inga, switching to my personal comm unit, demonstrate to the High Commission the operational status of your unmanned subordinates. Inga had a peculiar sense of humor, which I rather appreciated. So, naturally, she saw no better way to comply than to launch a volley of 5 training rockets from the jet packs of her unmanned Titans, straight into the belly of the cruiser, hanging overhead. That, apparently, was her way of showing the drone link was functioning just fine. The missiles, of course, were inert, but the cruiser captain took offense and attempted to swat the ground-roaming pests with guided bombs. Those, too, were training munitions. They lacked warheads or shrapnel, but the blinding flashes and thunderous detonations they produced gave a very convincing impression of real explosions. Bursts of light flickered across near orbit and the surface, followed by echoing concussions. Schiller's communicator buzzed again. Lieutenant General, sir, came a flustered voice from the device. This is Titan 5 Outer Orbital Station. We're detecting active combat above Titan. What's going on out there? Oh, gentlemen, no cause for alarm. It's just a training exercise. 5th Shock Division is conducting a live-fire coordination drill with the fleet. Everything is under control. Understood. Thank you for the update, Lieutenant General. Meanwhile, an entire division of bulls had deployed to the surface, complete with reinforcements. This was no cadet company anymore. The fight was heating up for real. Inga's Titans proved remarkably resistant to attempts to jam their uplinks. With the command unit, and Inga herself, with obvious enthusiasm, was peppering the bulls with guided rockets. Strangely, her missiles veered off course far less frequently than the heavy mech pilots were used to. Frustrated by the cruiser Washington's poor showing, Admiral Nelson decided to spice things up. Carrier Cobra, launch fighters. Have them engage the mock targets on the Planetary Assault Academy's training grounds, simulate atmospheric strike craft operations. What followed was a full-blown military spectacle, entirely disproportionate to the modest training grounds of the Planetary Assault Academy. Tons of training ordnance were consumed. The engines of space fighters roared, despite being ill-suited for atmospheric maneuvers. Salvos of missiles were exchanged with gusto between towering robots. The electromagnetic interference grew so intense that even Titan's civilian networks began to experience outages. A battle-hardened general and an equally combative admiral had just caught a glimpse of a weapon that might change the face of war, and they couldn't wait to put it through its paces. Schiller's communicator rang for the 3rd time. Lieutenant General Schiller, what the hell is going on out there? A voice barked. This is Army General Vasnetsov. What? I can barely hear you. Drills? What drills? Why wasn't I briefed? Do you have any idea how this looks from Earth? No? Then let me tell you. It looks like an invasion of Titan. I'm neck-deep in panicked calls. They almost deployed the Metropolitan Fleet to your location. What? New weapon? Briggs again? You never should have vouched for that kid. You'd be sleeping better at night. Anyway, Lieutenant General, shut that fireworks show down and wait for me and General Barrington. We're coming to see for ourselves what toy your boy Briggs has put in Nelson and Wolf's mischievous hands this time. Half the damn solar system is on high alert because of him. Generals Barrington and Vasnetsov arrived on Titan about 3 hours later. As ordered, the exercise had been put on hold, but the bulls and the Titans were still milling about at their original positions, and the ships of the 5th Shock Fleet had moved closer to Titan, awaiting orders from their admiral. And then it all nearly started again. But the army generals, perhaps more reasonable due to their age, somehow managed to rein in the escalating military mayhem in time. Gentlemen, I think that'll do for today, General Barrington summed up the demonstration. We'll continue tomorrow, but not here. The civilian population of Titan has had enough excitement for one day. Mr. Briggs, do you have the capability to redeploy your robots to another sector by tomorrow? We have an entire strike fleet hanging over our heads, General. Admiral Nelson answered on my behalf. Relocating a dozen heavy mechs is hardly a challenge. Fair enough. And another thing, Mr. Briggs. Tomorrow I'll be arriving as part of the Ministry of Defense Commission on New Technologies and Armaments. I understand you weren't preparing your prototypes for state trials, but based on what I've seen, we can't afford to waste time. Our army needs machines like these. One more question. What made you pursue the idea of an unmanned combat unit? This is an entirely new step, not only in our doctrine, but in the Roy coalitions as well. General, I replied, I believe that soldiers in armored exosuits have no place in modern frontline warfare. It's a relic, and by clinging to it, we're suffering needless losses. Do you know how much time and money it takes to properly train a single infantryman? And how does that compare to a combat robot's effectiveness? We should be protecting our people, but instead we send them into battle sometimes wearing little more than light armor. For a scout or saboteur, yes, exosuits are perfect. But for line infantry, they should be phased out entirely and replaced with unmanned drones. What we've demonstrated here is just half a division of heavy units. But we're already working on lighter models, ones that will eventually replace assault squads. In a typical landing boat, there will be only one human pilot in the command unit. The rest will be assault drones under their control. Survivability of each unit will increase significantly, casualties will plummet, and the most critical combat, metric, firepower density, will reach a new level. Barrington gave me a long look. He seemed about to ask something more, but in the end, all he said was, I hear you, Mr. Briggs. Be ready to receive my commission tomorrow at 1400 hours. Everything went smoothly at the new training ground. This time, the commission didn't include any lobbyists from our competitors, and General Barrington's new aides, a lieutenant general and a vice admiral, turned out to be level-headed. Professionals who took a genuine interest in the new concept. After the tests were over, Nelson and Wolf pulled me aside. Lieutenant. Nelson addressed me, still stubbornly treating me as an officer rather than the head of a private company. General Wolf invited me here to see your new toys. And I'll admit, I was curious, even though your developments don't really fall within my area of specialization. But I was promised you'd show me something that might actually be useful for the fleet. Is that true? Yes, Admiral. I replied without hesitation. I'm listening. Admiral, I have two concepts for you. They're only ideas for now, but what you saw on the ground these past 2 days is essentially their prototype. The first concept, imagine a squadron of 10 starfighters, only one of them piloted by a human. The rest are drones. It's a full, aerial equivalent of what you witnessed on the training ground. I see where you're going, Nelson nodded. And the second? Now imagine this, a full-scale fleet engagement. How often do fighters manage to get close to enemy capital ships? It happens every battle, Nelson said. But what can a fighter actually do to a battleship? You need heavy artillery or torpedoes. Fighters don't carry that kind of firepower. True. But imagine 10 unmanned craft, fighter-sized, dropping a few dozen assault drones right onto the enemy vessel's hull, boarding in space. The Admiral's face registered genuine shock. We never even try to capture damaged enemy ships. Too high a risk of self-destruct protocols. No one's willing to gamble lives like that. But that's the point, Admiral. No lives would be at risk. These would be remote-controlled drones, not people. Once inside, they'd neutralize the crew and key systems. That ship would immediately be out of the fight. I didn't bring up the other component, an untested extension of the control hijacking tech I'd used so successfully on Protus, 3, and Proxima. My goal was to adapt it for taking over enemy ships. But that pitch could wait. And how exactly would you control the drones inside the ship? External signals won't get through, and internal ones can't get out. We've worked on that, I said. The issue can be solved with a relay chain. I'll spare you the technical details, but yes, it's feasible. You know, Lieutenant, Nelson said. If anyone else had pitched this to me, I wouldn't have listened for more than 10 seconds. But after what I saw today, I believe you. You don't make empty promises. So what exactly are you asking for? A dozen aging fighters slated for decommission, but still flight-worthy, and permission to run live training exercises with your fleet assets when I have something to test.